Welcome to the endocrine system lecture. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the endocrine glands, the types of hormones they produce, the functions of those hormones, and then regulation mechanisms of hormone production. So we're just going to start with some basic information about what hormones are and how they actually travel through your body. So the endocrine system is a system of endocrine glands. Endocrine glands are glands that produce hormones. And hormones are very, very tiny chemicals that are produced and put directly into your blood to circulate throughout your body until that hormone reaches the target tissue. Now, how do you know which is the proper target tissue? Well, the proper target tissue is the tissue that has the receptor that binds that particular hormone. Now, just how we talked about enzymes and proteins, producing a hormone is not the entire big picture. You have to, number one, produce the hormone, but you have to also make the receptor for the hormone. If you made tenfold of whatever hormone you're producing, but you did not make the receptors for it, it doesn't matter how much hormone you produce, you're going to have no function or no effect from that hormone because you don't have a receptor for it. Now, there are three main classes of hormones that we have in our body. Amino acid hormones that are very small, and they're made out of just amino acids. And we'll talk about what amino acids are mostly used. There are peptide hormones, which are the protein-like hormones. These guys are proteinaceous, so they are produced by long chains of amino acids. And then you have steroid hormones, and their one big claim to fame is that they are hydrophobic. And we'll talk about the three of these at the end of this PowerPoint. There are a few endocrine glands in your body. I've listed them from top to bottom. And some of these endocrine glands are considered pure endocrine glands, which means their only function is to produce hormone. That includes pituitary, pineal, thyroid, parathyroid, and the adrenal gland. The other endocrine glands, they're not considered pure. They're more like secondary endocrine glands because in addition to producing hormone, they have a variety of other functions, like the pancreas. The pancreas has both an endocrine function to make hormones like insulin and glucagon, but it also has an exocrine function to make enzymes for things like pancreatic juices and digestion. So we'll first start by talking about the mechanism of hormone release, and then we'll start from the top of the body, work our way down, naming the gland, the hormone, and the function. The three mechanisms of hormone release are here. We have three illustrations with three examples, and then I've listed them up here as well. The first mechanism is called the humoral mechanism. This is a really common mechanism in your body because it's based off of you constantly sensing levels of hormone in the blood, the levels of ions in the blood, and other solutes, and making adjustments to help regulate them. A great example of the humoral mechanism is in the thyroid/parathyroid region. The large pink gland is the thyroid gland. The little yellow nuggets on the back of it is the parathyroid gland. We are looking at a posterior view here. In the middle of that gland, you have a capillary bed, and in that capillary bed, you have chemoreceptors. And chemoreceptors, as you know, measure chemical concentrations, and ions are considered types of chemicals. So in this particular region, the chemoreceptors are constantly measuring concentration of calcium in your blood. You must maintain a basal level of calcium to be considered healthy. Now, if the blood calcium level drops for some reason, whatever reason that may be, maybe you don't have enough calcium in your body, maybe you're going through osteoporosis, maybe your kidneys are excreting too much calcium, your blood calcium levels are low. The chemoreceptor will sense the low blood calcium level, and that low blood calcium level will trigger the activation of the parathyroid glands. When you activate the parathyroid gland, they produce parathyroid hormone. And the job of parathyroid hormone, and I'd like you to write this down, it does come again later in the PowerPoint, but just write it down now. The job of parathyroid hormone is to increase blood calcium concentrations. I will teach you how we do this, but for now, just know that parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium concentrations. The second mechanism of hormone release is the neural mechanism, and the word neural usually means something that has to do with the nervous system, the brain, or the spinal cord. The neural mechanism stimulates hormone production using the nerves. A great example of this is fear. When you get scared, the fear originates in your brain, travels down your spinal cord, out a nerve fiber, and innervates the adrenal gland. This is a gland that sits on top of your kidneys. The adrenal gland has a medulla, which means middle, and it has a cortex, which means the outer region. The medulla of the adrenal gland is responsible for making catecholamines. These guys are your stress hormones, like epinephrine and norepinephrine. So because you were afraid, you sent a signal through your nervous system to activate production and secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine to increase heart rate, increase respiratory rate, and shunt blood to places that are needed in the body. The last mechanism is the hormonal mechanism, and this is like a domino mechanism, I think. The hormonal mechanism is when you produce one hormone from one place, that hormone signals the production of another hormone, then that hormone signals the production of yet another hormone. The place we're going to see this most often is going to be in the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. This will be one of the first mechanisms I teach you in the next, I think, 2 or 3 slides. So we're going to start at the brain and make our way down. In the brain, you have 2 main regions for hormone production. The hypothalamus, which is right here in purple, and the pituitary gland, which is this little nugget in pink. Notice that it's connected to the hypothalamus by this stalk right here. We're going to talk about the hormones produced in the hypothalamus, which are called releasing and inhibiting hormones, and how the releasing and inhibiting hormones produced here will cause a change in function of hormone production here. So we'll start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus makes 2 groups of hormones, releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. The releasing hormones, there's 5 of them listed here. These 5 releasing hormones are produced and released by the hypothalamus to go down and activate the pituitary gland. The inhibiting hormones produced in the hypothalamus go down and inhibit the pituitary gland. So the releasing hormones, a few examples of them, is TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. Thyroid releasing hormone is produced in the hypothalamus, and it travels down to the pituitary gland to turn on thyroid stimulating hormone. When the pituitary gland makes this, what organ or gland do you think thyroid stimulating hormone is going to go and activate? It's going to activate the thyroid gland. So if you want to bubble these up together, I will show you how I will do it. Circle these ones. These ones are all from the hypothalamus. These ones are from the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus produces these releasing hormones to go and activate production of these hormones from the pituitary gland. So it happens in series. So first this will trigger production of then this. These hormones have their own effects. We'll talk about them in just a moment. The other class is the inhibiting hormones. There are 2 of them. These 2 inhibiting hormones are produced by the hypothalamus, and they go to the pituitary gland to turn off or inhibit their associated hormones. So it is safe to say that the brain has a huge role in hormone production. Now, down at the pituitary gland, The pituitary gland is made out of two lobes. I don't know if you remember this from anatomy, but it looks kind of like this. So we've got an anterior division and a posterior division, and we'll see the picture coming up soon. But let's label this A, and let's label this P. The anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland, although they're both part of the pituitary gland, they are two completely different animals, okay? Think of them as two oceans, very, very separate from each other because they produce very different hormones. The anterior pituitary makes 7 hormones, while the posterior makes 2. Different names for the anterior pituitary is adenohypophyses, and posterior is neurohypophyses. The anterior gland makes the 7 hormones, but 4 of them I've grouped together are called tropic hormones. And tropic hormones are hormones that do the hormonal mechanism. We talked about that a few slides ago. That means these are hormones that go and activate production of another group of hormones, and then those hormones can go and activate production of another group of hormones. So what's the difference between these tropic hormones and this right here? Well, these hormones are directly acting. These hormones, like growth hormone, they're not going to go and activate production of other hormones. They're just going to go do their job. Growth hormone's job is to bind to receptors in your bone and signal them to grow. Prolactin's job is to go and bind to receptors in the mammary glands or the uterus and help with lactation. In the posterior pituitary, this one's much easier. There are only 2 hormones that are secreted out of the posterior pituitary. ADH, which you should be very familiar with now, and oxytocin, which helps with childbirth. So this is the slide that tells you all the abbreviations and the functions of the hormones. I'm not going to go over every single one of these because you can just read them off the slide directly. But you've got the 4 tropic hormones here and the 3 non-tropic hormones here. This whole slide is for the anterior pituitary. So I'll go over maybe one of them. ACTH, adenocorticotropic hormone. This is a hormone produced by the anterior pituitary, and it travels through your blood down to the adrenal cortex, hence the name adenocorticotropic hormone. Adenocortico refers to adrenal cortex. So this hormone goes to the adrenal cortex and stimulates the cortex to produce these hormones, aldosterone and cortisol. Then again, these 3 here, they don't stimulate production of any other hormone. They just go do their job straight away. The 2 from the posterior pituitary, ADH, causes your kidneys to hold in more water, increasing your blood volume and blood pressure. Oxytocin goes and binds to your smooth muscle in the uterus to cause smooth muscle contraction, and it also goes and binds to the mammary glands to help with milk production and ejection. Now, this slide is pretty important. I'd like you to star this slide because this shows mechanism. And some students find this slide difficult, so be sure to take it slow if you find yourself struggling, and then email me if you still don't understand it by the end of this slide. The posterior and anterior pituitary, I told you the one reason that they differ is because they make different hormones. But they also differ in how they secrete those hormones. So I'm going to get my pen here because I'm going to put some notes on this. The posterior pituitary, we'll start with this one. This one's a much more simple one. The posterior pituitary, if you notice, the hormone up in the hypothalamus is the same as the hormone color down in the posterior pituitary. This is because the posterior pituitary gland doesn't produce oxytocin and ADH. It simply stores them. So where are these 2 produced? They're produced up here in the hypothalamus. Now, so far you've learned that the hypothalamus makes inhibiting hormones and releasing hormones. That is only true for the anterior pituitary. So inhibiting and releasing hormones, only true for anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, the hypothalamus will make oxytocin and ADH, ship them down, and just store them here in the terminals of these neurons. These hormones are only released into the blood circulation to go out into the body when needed. So again, the posterior pituitary doesn't make oxytocin or ADH, it just stores it after the hypothalamus makes it and ships them down. Now this one is the one that's a little bit more complex. The hypothalamus will make either inhibiting hormones or releasing hormones. These hormones will get produced in the hypothalamus. They travel down into this first capillary bed. That inhibiting or releasing hormone goes into this capillary bed and travels down into the second capillary bed. Now, you notice the hormones up here are pink, they're pink, they're pink. It's the same hormone. But once we get over here, the inhibiting or releasing hormone is going to leave the capillary bed and actually stimulate the cells of the anterior pituitary to make those hormones that we talked about here. So the inhibiting and releasing hormones are made in the hypothalamus. They travel down, enter into the first capillary bed to make their way down into the anterior pituitary gland, where they diffuse out into the tissues of the anterior pituitary, stimulating those cells to produce their own hormones. Those hormones get put back into the capillary bed, and then out they go to the rest of the body. So, the anterior pituitary itself will make all of these hormones. Versus in the posterior pituitary, that posterior pituitary gland doesn't make these hormones. It just stores them after they're produced in the hypothalamus. Please make sure you understand the difference between secretion of hormones in posterior and anterior pituitary, as well as the names of the hormones they produce and their functions. Working our way down a little bit more, we have the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is going to be found wrapped around your trachea, and it's on the anterior portion. If you see this guy here, that's the thyroid gland here. So right over here, it's connected by this bridge called the isthmus. The thyroid gland makes two hormones: thyroid hormone, which requires iodine, and calcitonin, which is involved with calcium and phosphorus metabolism. Now, if you have ever seen pictures of people with goiters, what you'll notice is that they have a huge bump over here, a huge inflammation or swelling of their thyroid gland. People that live in third world countries who don't have the availability of iodine are going to have issues with their thyroid gland. Now, iodine is not something that's naturally found in just foods that we eat on a daily basis. This is why salt comes in an iodized form. They add the iodine to the salt to help with thyroid function. This gland will also produce calcitonin, and we'll talk about its function in just a moment. Inside the thyroid gland, if we took a histological cross-section, you would see something that looks like this, like bubbles. These open spaces covered with a lining of cells. Now, if we look at the cartoon version, the open space is called the colloid. The lining of cells are called follicle cells. Make sure you know the names of the cells and what they produce. Follicle cells make something called thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is the precursor of the hormone, thyroid hormone. Another word for thyroid hormone is thyroxine. I will be using these two interchangeably because that's how you'll see it in a lot of textbooks as well as a lot of online sources. So thyroid hormone and thyroxine are the same thing, and their precursor is thyroglobulin. So the follicle cells make thyroid hormone, and outside of them you have these cells called parafollicular C cells. And I think these are easy to remember because parafollicular C cells make calcitonin. And calcitonin, again, is responsible for calcium and phosphorus metabolism. Now, before we get into the functions of those hormones, I want to go over the feedback loop for how you activate or suppress production of, let's say, thyroid hormone. So this works with the humoral mechanism, sensing how much hormone you have in your blood and producing more if needed. So you have a blood vessel that goes through the thyroid gland, and it has chemoreceptors on it. There are vessels that are also found in the brain that have chemoreceptors on them. So for this situation, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and how that has a role in controlling thyroid hormone production. So let's say you are low in thyroid hormone in your blood. That blood eventually gets to your brain. When it goes to the hypothalamus has chemoreceptors that sense that you have low thyroid hormone in your blood. That hypothalamus will say, hey, because they have low thyroid hormone, let me make thyroid releasing hormone and send that to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary will then make thyroid stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone will stimulate the thyroid to produce more thyroglobulin, which will then turn into thyroxine. Thyroxine, again, is just another name for thyroid hormone. So again, one more time through this. If your blood is low in thyroid hormone, the chemoreceptors in your hypothalamus will sense it. They will produce thyroid-releasing hormone. That thyroid-releasing hormone will go to the anterior pituitary for it to produce thyroid-stimulating hormone. Thyroid-stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroglobulin, which is then converted into thyroxine. And you have now successfully increased the thyroid hormone concentration in your blood. This is a mechanism, like a feedback mechanism, but you can also call it the humoral mechanism. So now, what are the functions of these hormones? Well, thyroid hormone is really there to help stabilize your BMR, the basal metabolic rate. The more thyroid hormone you have, the higher the BMR is. The lower it is, the lower your BMR will be. Basal metabolic rate is just the rate at which your tissues use oxygen to convert nutrients into ATP. Thyroid hormone also helps with protein synthesis, bone growth, and neuronal maturation and cell differentiation during fetal development. So pretty important hormone here. Calcitonin, however, very different function. Calcitonin's job is to essentially lower your blood calcium levels. You only make this hormone when your blood calcium levels are too high. So, if your blood calcium is too high, your thyroid gland will produce calcitonin, and calcitonin is a hormone that helps clear your blood of some calcium. How does it do this? Well, it slows down osteoclast activity. Osteoclasts are types of cells in your bone that break down your bone. Now think, what's stored in your bone? What do you as humans store in your bone? Well, a lot of minerals, but one of the most predominant minerals is calcium. So if you have osteoclasts breaking down your bone, they're releasing calcium into your blood. The job of calcitonin is to say, hey, osteoclasts, can you guys slow down your function? you're releasing too much calcium into the blood. Now our blood calcium levels are way too high. So we slow down osteoclast activity, but we also increase calcium secretion by the kidneys. What does this word mean in relation to kidney function? I'll give you a clue. It's the opposite of reabsorption. Reabsorption is taking solutes back into your blood from the tubule. Secretion is taking solutes from the blood and putting it into the kidney's tubule to be excreted and peed out. So if your blood calcium levels are too high, one of the things you're going to do is pee out more calcium. Now, behind the thyroid gland, you have these little nuggets here. There's 4 little nuggets on this picture. Some people only have 2, and it's totally fine. But these are called parathyroid glands. We briefly mentioned this when we talked about the humoral mechanism. The parathyroid gland makes something called parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone does the complete opposite of calcitonin. Calcitonin's job is to lower blood calcium levels, which means what is parathyroid hormone's job? To increase blood calcium levels. Now, in the parathyroid gland, you have 2 main cells, chief cells and oxyphil cells. Chief cells are the cells that produce parathyroid hormone. Oxyphil cells, we have no idea what they do, which means you don't need to know what they do either. So either evolutionarily, these guys had a function and they lost it over time, or we're in the process of evolving these cells to produce another hormone. For now, we don't know what they do. Now star this slide all over. This is a slide I really, really want you to know. The function of parathyroid hormone. And I stress this slide because there's a lot of good information on here for test questions. Parathyroid hormone's job, like we said, was to increase the blood calcium levels. So in this area, when blood travels through, there are chemoreceptors that say, hey, your blood calcium is too low. It signals the parathyroid gland to produce parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone is going to somehow, some way, increase your blood calcium levels. There are 3 main ways for this to be done. Make sure you know these 3. Number 1, stimulate the osteoclasts now. Have them work harder, break down more bone, release more calcium into the blood. Then decrease secretion of calcium by kidneys. Hold that calcium in. Do not pee it out. And the last one is to activate vitamin D. Now, maybe you guys didn't know this, but vitamin D activation is going to help produce something called calcitrol. Calcitrol is an enzyme that helps you absorb calcium from the digestive system. The more calcitrol you have, the more calcium you can absorb from the foods that you eat. So sunshine and vitamin D and calcitrol, all of these participate in calcium absorption from the small intestine to go into your blood. So parathyroid hormone, calcitonin have completely opposite effects. Now, this is the second time now I'm going over this. We did go over this on like one of the first 3 slides. This is the negative feedback of how we regulate calcium levels using parathyroid hormone. If your blood calcium is low, we stimulate the parathyroid cell to make parathyroid hormone. The hormone travels through your blood to your bone and to your kidney. At the bone, it increases resorption of the bone. If you would like, you can circle the word resorption and write the word breakdown. Resorption means to break down. It also increases the reabsorption of calcium. Let me pause here for a moment. This word and this word are not the same word. Resorption means breakdown. Reabsorption means to absorb it back into the blood, back into the body. So take calcium from the nephron and put it back into your body. And then it goes to the digestive system to produce calcitrol to increase intestinal absorption of calcium into the body from the foods that you ate. All three of these will increase blood plasma calcium levels, and higher calcium in the plasma will negatively feed back to the parathyroid cells, turning them off because now you have enough calcium in the blood.